Elena Marchetti's hands were shaking so badly that her mother had to hold them still just to fasten the small pearl buttons on her wedding gloves. It was 6 in the morning, and in 3 hours she would become the wife of Duke Sebastian Ashworth. She should have felt joy. Instead, a strange coldness sat in her chest, one she could not explain and did not want to name. "You are trembling like a leaf," her mother, Isabella, said softly, pressing Elena's fingers between her own. "Is it nerves, my dear, or is it something else?" Elena forced a smile. "Just nerves, Mama. Every bride feels this way." But that was not entirely true. For the past 2 weeks, ever since the invitations had been sent out and the final wedding preparations had begun, Elena had noticed something different in Sebastian. He answered her letters more slowly. He canceled 2 dinners at the last moment, citing business in the capital, and once, when she visited his estate unannounced, she saw a woman's silk shawl draped over a chair in his private study, a shawl that was certainly not hers. She had asked him about it. He had laughed it off, calling it a gift meant for his sister, forgotten there by a servant. Elena had wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, because her family's future depended on this marriage. Her father, Antonio Marchetti, had once owned 3 shipping vessels and a warehouse filled with goods from across the sea. But bad investments and a devastating storm had taken almost everything from him in the span of 2 years. By the time Sebastian's marriage proposal arrived, the Marchetti family was quietly drowning in debt that no one outside the household knew about. A marriage to a duke was not simply an opportunity, it was survival. Elena had grown up believing that love was something a woman earned through patience and loyalty, not something given freely at first sight. So when Sebastian proposed after only 3 brief meetings, she told herself that respect and comfort could grow into something real, given enough time. She had seen it happen to other women in her circle. Why not her? Her closest friend, Charlotte, believed differently. Charlotte had grown up beside Elena since childhood, and she was the only person brave enough to say aloud what others only whispered. "You do not know this man," Charlotte had told her the night before, as they sat together in Elena's bedroom, surrounded by wedding gifts still wrapped in ribbon. "You know his title, you know his estate, but do you know his heart?" "I know enough," Elena had replied, though her voice lacked its usual certainty. "He has been kind to me. He has been generous to my family. That must count for something." Charlotte had looked at her for a long moment, then simply nodded and said nothing more. But the worry in her eyes lingered in Elena's mind long after Charlotte had gone home. Now, standing in front of the mirror in her wedding gown, Elena tried to push those doubts away. The dress was beautiful, made of ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves that had once belonged to her grandmother. The veil, 3 generations old, was the same one her mother had worn, and her mother's mother before that. It was said to bring good fortune to any bride who wore it with an honest heart. Elena wondered, briefly, if her heart was honest enough to deserve that fortune, given how many small doubts she had chosen to bury rather than face. A knock came at the door. It was Josephine, her lady's maid and closest confidant among the household staff, carrying a small box wrapped in blue paper. "A gift has arrived for you, miss," Josephine said, though her expression seemed troubled rather than pleased, "from the Duke's household." But there was no card, and the delivery boy seemed nervous, if I am honest. Elena opened the box carefully. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, finely made, clearly expensive, but engraved on the inside of the clasp, in small letters easy to miss, were 2 initials that were not Elena's own. C and A. Elena's stomach tightened. Her own name began with E. Sebastian's family name began with A. But the C made no sense at all, unless it belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose name Elena did not yet know. "Perhaps it was meant for someone else," Josephine offered quickly, seeing the color drain from Elena's face. "A mistake. These things happen at large households, miss, especially before a grand wedding, with so many gifts coming and going." Elena nodded, though she did not believe it. She placed the bracelet back in its box and set it aside, telling herself she would ask Sebastian about it after the ceremony, when there was time to speak honestly and privately, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. She had made this decision countless times over the past weeks. Ask him later. Deal with it later. Trust him for now, because the wedding was too close, the guests too many, and the cost of turning back too great for her family to bear. Downstairs, the household had come alive with activity. Musicians tuned their instruments in the garden, where a smaller reception would be held after the main ceremony at the cathedral. Cooks shouted orders in the kitchen. Carriages arrived one after another, carrying relatives Elena had not seen in years, all eager to witness the joining of the Marchetti name with one of the oldest noble houses in the region. Her father found her in the hallway just before it was time to leave for the cathedral. He looked older than she remembered, his shoulders slightly bent under a weight only he fully understood. "You look exactly like your mother did on her wedding day," Antonio said, his voice thick with emotion. "I only wish I could give you a wedding built on nothing but love, rather than necessity." "You have given me everything you could, Papa," Elena said, taking his hands. "I do not blame you for any of this." "But do you want this marriage?" he asked quietly. "If you told me right now that you wish to stop everything, I would find a way. I would rather face our debts honestly than send my daughter into an unhappy home." For a moment, Elena considered telling him the truth. About the cancelled dinners, about the shawl in the study, about the bracelet with strange initials sitting in a box upstairs, but she looked at her father's tired eyes and thought of her mother's quiet worry over unpaid accounts, and she said the only thing she could bring herself to say, "I want this marriage, Papa, truly." She was not entirely certain if she was lying to him or to herself. The carriage ride to the cathedral felt longer than it should have. Elena watched the city pass by through the small window, streets she had known her entire life now dressed with flowers and ribbons in honor of the wedding. Crowds had gathered outside the cathedral, eager to catch a glimpse of the bride before the doors closed for the ceremony. As the carriage slowed, Elena noticed a woman standing apart from the crowd, dressed in a striking shade of emerald green that stood out sharply against the more modest colors worn by the townspeople. The woman was watching the carriage with an expression Elena could not quite read. Not excitement, not curiosity, something closer to quiet calculation. Elena turned to her mother. "Do you know who that woman is? The one in green, near the cathedral steps?" Isabella glanced out the window, but the woman had already disappeared into the crowd. "I did not see her clearly, dear. Perhaps a guest arriving early. Do not concern yourself with strangers today. Today belongs to you." Elena nodded, though the image of the woman in emerald green stayed with her as she stepped down from the carriage and approached the grand doors of the cathedral, where her new life was waiting to begin, whether she was fully ready for it or not. Inside, the organ began to play. Elena took a deep breath, adjusted her veil with trembling fingers, and placed her hand on her father's arm. Whatever waited beyond those doors, there was no turning back now. The great doors of the cathedral opened, and sunlight poured across the stone floor in a wide golden path leading straight to the altar. Elena took her first step inside on her father's arm, and every face in the crowded pews turned toward her at once. She felt her heart pounding beneath her ribs, loud enough that she wondered if the people nearest to her could hear it too. The cathedral was filled beyond what Elena had expected. Nobles from distant provinces sat beside local merchants who had done business with her father for decades. Bishops and clergy stood near the altar in their ceremonial robes, and above them all, stained glass windows scattered colored light across the guests like scattered jewels. At the far end of the aisle stood Sebastian, dressed in a deep navy coat with gold trim, looking every bit the duke that his title promised. He smiled when he saw her, a smile that seemed genuine enough to calm some of Elena's nerves. Perhaps, she told herself, all of her doubts had simply been the result of wedding stress. Perhaps everything would be fine after all. As she walked slowly down the aisle, matching her pace to the music, Elena allowed herself to look past Sebastian for just a moment, taking in the full scope of the guests who had come to witness her marriage. Her eyes moved across rows of unfamiliar faces, until they landed on a woman seated in the second row on the groom's side, a position typically reserved for close family. It was the woman in emerald green. Up close, she was even more striking than she had appeared outside the cathedral. Dark hair pinned elegantly beneath a small feathered hat, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that watched Elena's approach with an intensity that made the hair on Elena's arms rise. She did not smile. She did not look away either. Elena forced her gaze back to Sebastian, refusing to let anything disturb the ceremony now that she had come this far. She reached the altar and released her father's arm, taking her place beside her groom. "You look beautiful," Sebastian whispered, taking her hand. Thank you, Elena replied, though her voice felt distant, even to her own ears. The priest began the ceremony with words Elena had heard recited at countless weddings throughout her life, yet today they felt strange and heavy, as though each phrase carried more weight than usual. She listened to promises about loyalty and honesty, about forsaking all others, about building a life founded on trust. Throughout the opening prayers, Elena noticed Sebastian's eyes drift more than once toward the second row. Each time, she told herself it was her imagination, a trick of nervous energy and lingering suspicion from the bracelet she had discovered that morning. But by the third time she caught him glancing in that direction, she could no longer convince herself it meant nothing. Beside Elena's mother, seated in the front row on the bride's side, Josephine had positioned herself near enough to observe the ceremony, while quietly keeping watch, as she always did during important family occasions. She noticed the same pattern Elena had noticed, and her frown deepened with each passing minute. Leaning slightly toward an older woman seated beside her, a distant cousin of Elena's named Margaret, Josephine whispered, "Do you know who that woman is? In the green dress? Second row?" Margaret glanced toward the woman, then quickly looked away, her expression tightening. "I believe her name is Camille Duval," she whispered back. "A friend of the Duke's family, or so I have heard." "A friend? Close enough to sit with family during his wedding?" Josephine asked, unable to hide her skepticism. Margaret said nothing further, but her silence spoke volumes. The ceremony continued. The priest spoke of love that endures through hardship, of partnerships built on mutual respect, of two families joined together not merely through contract, but through genuine affection. Elena tried to focus on the words, tried to let them settle into her heart the way she had always imagined they would on her wedding day, but her attention kept drifting, pulled by an invisible thread toward the second row, toward the woman named Camille, who sat with a composure that seemed almost rehearsed, almost too calm for a mere family friend attending a wedding. When it came time for the exchange of vows, Sebastian turned to face Elena fully, taking both her hands in his. His expression softened, and for a brief moment, Elena saw something that looked like genuine warmth in his eyes. "Elena Marchetti," he began, his voice steady and clear enough to carry through the entire cathedral. "I promise to honor you, to protect you, and to remain faithful to you, for as long as we both shall live." The words should have brought Elena comfort. Instead, they struck her strangely, almost painfully, because as he spoke them, his gaze flickered once more, so briefly that only someone watching closely would have caught it, toward the second row. Elena felt something inside her chest grow very still and very cold. She spoke her own vows when it was her turn, her voice quieter than Sebastian's but no less clear, promising loyalty and devotion in the traditional words expected of every bride. As she spoke, she watched Sebastian's face carefully, searching for any sign of the same distraction she had noticed in him. She found none. His eyes remained fixed on her throughout her vows, attentive and warm, as though the earlier glances toward the second row had never happened at all. Perhaps, Elena thought, she was allowing her earlier doubts to poison what should have been a beautiful moment. Perhaps the bracelet with the strange initials truly had been an innocent mistake, meant for someone else entirely. Perhaps the woman named Camille was, as Margaret had suggested, nothing more than a family friend seated in a place of honor, due to some connection Elena simply did not know about yet. She wanted, desperately, to believe these gentler explanations. The priest moved forward with the ceremony, preparing to bless the rings that would soon rest on their fingers as permanent symbols of the promises they had just exchanged. As he lifted the small velvet cushion holding the two golden bands, a hush fell over the cathedral, the kind of silence that comes just before a moment of great significance. It was during this silence that Elena heard it. A soft sound, almost too quiet to notice, coming from somewhere near the second row. A sound like fabric shifting, like someone leaning forward slightly to see better, followed by the faintest exhale, almost a sigh, that carried just far enough for Elena's trained ear to catch. She did not turn to look. She kept her eyes fixed forward, on the priest, on the rings, on the ceremony that was supposed to be the happiest moment of her life. But something inside her had shifted, quietly and permanently, in that brief exchange of sound she could not fully explain. The priest blessed the rings, and Sebastian slid the smaller band onto Elena's finger with practiced ease, his hands steady, his expression unreadable now in a way that unsettled her more than open guilt would have. "With this ring," he said, "I thee wed." Elena repeated the words as she placed the matching ring on his finger, feeling the cool metal against her skin, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her like a heavy cloak she had not asked to wear. The priest turned to address the full congregation, his voice rising with the solemn authority of his position. "If any person here present knows of any reason why this couple should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." It was tradition. Elena had heard the same words recited at every wedding she had ever attended, and never once had anyone spoken. The silence that followed was expected, ordinary, a mere formality, before the priest continued toward the final blessing. But this time, the silence felt different. It stretched a beat too long, thick and heavy, as though the entire cathedral was holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet happened, but somehow felt inevitable. Elena glanced, almost against her will, toward the second row. Camille was staring directly at her. Their eyes met across the crowded cathedral, and in that single locked gaze, Elena understood something she had refused to fully accept until that very moment. Whatever connection this woman had to Sebastian, it was not the innocent friendship Margaret had described. There was something possessive in Camille's stare, something that spoke of intimacy and history, far deeper than a passing acquaintance. The priest, unaware of the silent exchange happening before him, cleared his throat and prepared to move forward with the final blessing that would officially declare Elena and Sebastian husband and wife. Elena's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that she almost missed the priest's next words entirely. Her mind raced through the events of the morning, the bracelet, the initials, the shawl she had found weeks earlier, the cancelled dinners, the strange coldness that had grown between herself and Sebastian even as their wedding day approached. Every piece was beginning to form a picture she did not want to see, yet could no longer ignore. The priest raised his hands to deliver the final blessing over the newly married couple, and the cathedral fell into complete, expectant silence, waiting for the ceremony to reach its conclusion. Elena stood perfectly still, her veil covering her face, her hands trembling slightly within Sebastian's grip, as she made a quiet decision that would change everything that happened next. The priest's hands remained raised above the couple, ready to deliver the final blessing that would seal the marriage before God and every witness gathered in the cathedral. Elena felt Sebastian's fingers tighten slightly around her own, a small gesture meant to be reassuring, though it did nothing to calm the storm building inside her. She thought of her father's words from that morning, offering to stop everything if she wished it, promising to face their debts honestly rather than send her into an unhappy home. She thought of her mother's careful hands fastening the pearl buttons on her gloves, hoping only for her daughter's happiness. She thought of Charlotte's warning the night before, spoken with the courage that only true friendship allows. And she thought of Camille's steady gaze from the second row, a look that held no shame, no discomfort at being caught staring, only quiet certainty, as though she believed she had every right to be exactly where she sat. Elena made her decision in the space of a single heartbeat. Before the priest could speak the final blessing, Elena raised her own hands and slowly lifted the veil away from her face. The delicate lace, 3 generations old, passed down through her family as a symbol of honest hearts and good fortune, lifted gently over her head and settled against her hair, leaving her face fully visible to everyone in the cathedral. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not part of the ceremony. Veils were traditionally lifted after the final blessing, not before it, and certainly not by the bride's own hand in the middle of a silence meant only for objections that never came. The priest lowered his hands, confusion clear on his face. "My dear," he said gently, "the blessing has not yet been completed." "I apologize for the interruption, Father," Elena said, her voice carrying further than she expected across the stone walls of the cathedral. "But before you continue, I have a question I must ask, in front of everyone gathered here today." Sebastian's grip on her hand tightened further, though this time there was nothing reassuring in it. "Elena," he said quietly, leaning close enough that only she could hear him, "whatever this is, we can discuss it later, privately." "I do not wish to discuss it later," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady, despite the trembling she felt throughout her entire body. "I wish to discuss it now." She turned away from Sebastian and faced the congregation, her eyes moving deliberately toward the second row. toward the woman in emerald green, who had not moved an inch since Elena's veil had come off. "Would someone please tell me," Elena said, her voice clear and unwavering, "who that woman is, seated in the place of honor reserved for family?" The cathedral fell into a silence far heavier than the one that had preceded it, a silence filled with held breath and darting eyes, guests glancing at one another, unsure whether to look toward Elena, toward Sebastian, or toward the woman now being addressed directly in front of hundreds of witnesses. Camille rose slowly from her seat, smoothing the front of her emerald dress with unnerving calm. "My name is Camille Duval," she said, her voice steady and clear enough for the entire cathedral to hear. "I believe the introduction owes more to your husband than to me." Every eye in the cathedral turned toward Sebastian. His face had gone pale, all the earlier warmth drained from his expression, replaced by something closer to panic, barely held in check. "This is neither the time nor the place," he said, forcing a tight smile toward the guests, attempting to salvage what remained of the ceremony. "Camille is an old family friend. Elena, please, let us finish the ceremony with dignity." "Dignity," Elena repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. "You wish to speak to me of dignity, after inviting your mistress to sit in the second row of my wedding." The word landed in the cathedral, like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples of shocked whispers through every pew. Guests who had been sitting quietly now leaned toward one another, exchanging hurried words behind gloved hands, while others simply stared, too stunned to react at all. "That is a serious accusation," the priest said, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to simply continue the ceremony, while such a claim hung unanswered in the air. "Duke Ashworth, is there truth to what your bride suggests?" Sebastian's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and in his silence, Elena found the answer she had already suspected since discovering the bracelet that morning. "I have known Camille for many years," Sebastian finally said, choosing his words with visible care. "Our relationship, whatever it may have been in the past, has no bearing on my commitment to Elena today." "No bearing," Elena said quietly, though the quiet did nothing to soften the sharpness of her tone. "You brought her to our wedding, Sebastian. You seated her among your family. Explain to me how that has no bearing on the promises you just made in front of everyone here." Josephine, seated in the front row, reached over and took Isabella's trembling hand, both women watching the scene unfold, with growing horror. Antonio Marchetti had risen halfway from his seat, torn between rushing to his daughter's side and remaining still enough not to disrupt whatever was happening at the altar. Sebastian glanced toward Camille, a brief exchange that Elena caught immediately, a silent communication built from years of familiarity that no explanation could erase. Whatever remained of Elena's doubt disappeared entirely in that single glance. "Elena," Sebastian said, turning back to her, his voice lowering as though a softer tone might somehow undo the damage already spreading through the cathedral. "Marriages such as ours are built on practical foundations. My family needed this alliance, and yours needed the security it provides. What happens beyond the ceremony need not concern you, so long as you are treated with respect and given every comfort befitting your new title." The words struck Elena harder than any of the earlier revelations, because they confirmed something far worse than infidelity alone. Sebastian did not view their marriage as a partnership built on mutual respect, as the priest had described only minutes earlier. He viewed it as an arrangement, a transaction, in which Elena's feelings simply did not factor into the final calculation. "You speak of respect," Elena said, her voice growing steadier with each word, the earlier trembling replaced by something firmer, something that surprised even herself. "Yet you invited the woman you have been unfaithful with to witness the very ceremony meant to bind us together. Tell me, Sebastian, what version of respect includes such cruelty?" Camille, who had remained standing throughout this exchange, finally spoke again, her tone carrying none of the shame Elena might have expected from a woman caught in such a position. "Perhaps," Camille said, addressing Elena directly for the first time, "you should ask yourself why a duke would need to seek comfort elsewhere in the first place." Gasps echoed through the cathedral at the audacity of the statement, and Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, though not from embarrassment. It was anger, pure and clarifying, burning away the last remnants of doubt and hesitation that had clouded her judgment throughout the entire morning. "You dare to speak to me of comfort," Elena said, turning fully to face Camille, "when you sat calmly through an entire wedding ceremony, watching a man make promises to another woman that you clearly expected him to break the moment the doors of this cathedral closed behind us. Camille's composure faltered slightly for the first time, a flicker of something uncertain crossing her features before her expression hardened once more. Sebastian and I have an understanding that predates his engagement to you, she said. An understanding that was never meant to end, simply because circumstances required him to marry. Circumstances, Elena repeated, shaking her head slowly. You speak of our marriage as though it were nothing more than an inconvenient formality, standing between you and the man you claim to love. The priest, visibly distressed by the scene unfolding before him, attempted once more to intervene. Perhaps, he suggested carefully, this conversation would be better continued in private, away from the eyes of so many witnesses. No, Elena said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her own voice. I have spent the past several weeks ignoring warning after warning, telling myself that trust and patience would carry me through any doubts I felt. I will not spend another moment pretending that what has happened here today is anything less than a betrayal, witnessed by everyone in this cathedral. She turned to face the full congregation once more, her veil still resting against her hair rather than covering her face, her posture straight despite the storm raging within her chest. I came here today prepared to build a life founded on honesty and mutual respect, Elena continued, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the cathedral. Instead, I discover that my husband invited his mistress to witness our vows, seating her among his own family, as though her presence there were nothing unusual at all. Sebastian reached for her hand once more, his expression shifting from panic to something closer to desperation. Elena, please, we can find a way through this. Give me the chance to explain everything properly, away from all these eyes. Elena looked down at his hand resting against hers, then slowly withdrew her fingers from his grasp, the gold ring he had placed there only minutes earlier catching the light from the stained glass windows above them. There is nothing left to explain, she said quietly, though her words carried through the silent cathedral with unmistakable clarity. You have shown me exactly who you are, Sebastian, and exactly how little you value the promises you make. She removed the ring from her finger and held it out toward him, her hand steady, despite everything that had just unfolded. The cathedral held its breath, every guest waiting to see what Elena Marchetti would do next. Sebastian stared at the ring resting in Elena's open palm, his face caught between disbelief and something that looked almost like fear. Behind him, whispers had turned into open murmuring, guests no longer bothering to hide their reactions as the scandal unfolded before their eyes. Elena, he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her, though the silence of the cathedral carried it to those standing nearest the altar. Think of your family. Think of what this marriage secures for them. A public scene will not undo what has already happened between Camille and myself, but it will destroy everything your parents have worked to protect. The mention of her family struck Elena harder than anything he had said before, precisely because she knew he intended it to. He was not appealing to her heart. He was appealing to her fear, using her family's fragile finances as leverage to keep her silent and compliant, exactly as he had likely planned to do for the rest of their marriage. You speak of my family's protection, Elena said, yet you never once considered my protection when you invited your mistress into this cathedral. You are asking me to accept humiliation quietly so that your reputation remains untouched. That is not what I meant, Sebastian said quickly, though his tone lacked the conviction needed to make the denial believable. Antonio Marchetti could remain seated no longer. He rose fully from his place in the front pew and walked toward the altar, ignoring the priest's uncertain glance and the murmurs that followed his movement. He stopped beside his daughter, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. Elena, he said gently, whatever you decide in this moment, know that your mother and I stand behind you completely. Do not let concern for our finances guide your choice today. Antonio, Sebastian said, turning toward him with obvious relief at the possibility of an ally. Surely you understand the importance of maintaining this alliance. Both our families have invested a great deal in this union. Antonio's expression hardened, in a way Elena had rarely seen from her gentle, weary father. I invested in a marriage built on honesty, he said, not in a bargain that requires my daughter to endure betrayal in silence for the sake of appearances. Sebastian's mouth opened, then closed again, clearly unprepared for resistance from a man he had assumed would prioritize financial security above all else. Camille, watching this exchange with growing impatience, stepped forward slightly. "This has become rather more dramatic than necessary," she said, addressing the gathered guests as much as anyone at the altar. "Arrangements such as this exist throughout noble society. Perhaps the bride simply lacks the sophistication to understand how such marriages truly function." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the crowd at the insult, and Elena felt something shift within herself, the last traces of shock burning away entirely, replaced by a clarity she had not expected to find in the middle of such chaos. "Sophistication," Elena repeated, turning to face Camille directly. "You mistake cruelty for sophistication, and deception for tradition. I may be young, and I may have entered this marriage with more hope than caution, but I understand precisely what has happened here today. You and Sebastian built your understanding on the assumption that I would remain silent, grateful for a title and a fortune, regardless of how I was treated behind closed doors. And you believe walking away changes anything?" Camille asked, a note of genuine curiosity mixing with her earlier scorn. "You will lose everything this marriage was meant to provide. Your family's debts will remain unpaid. Your reputation will suffer far more than mine ever could." Elena considered the words carefully before responding, aware that everyone in the cathedral was listening, waiting to see how she would answer such a direct challenge. "Perhaps my reputation will suffer in certain circles," Elena said finally, "but I would rather live with a damaged reputation and an honest conscience than remain married to a man who valued my silence over my dignity." She turned back to Sebastian, still holding the ring out toward him, her hand no longer trembling. "Take this back," she said. "I release you from whatever obligation you believe you still hold toward me, and I release myself from any obligation I once believed I held toward you." Sebastian did not move to take the ring. Instead, he glanced around the cathedral, taking in the shocked faces of nobility and merchants alike, clearly calculating the damage this scene would cause to his own standing, separate from any concern for Elena's feelings. "If you walk away now," he said quietly, "there will be no path back to this arrangement. My family will not offer such generous terms a second time, should you reconsider once the initial embarrassment fades." "I have no intention of reconsidering," Elena replied. "Not now, and not after any amount of time has passed." The priest, who had remained largely silent throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice again. "Duke Ashworth," he said carefully, "given the circumstances now revealed before this entire congregation, I cannot in good conscience proceed with the final blessing of this marriage, unless both parties freely consent to continue, with full understanding of everything that has been said here today." "I do not consent," Elena said immediately, before Sebastian could offer any response of his own. "I withdraw from this marriage, effective this moment, in front of every witness gathered here." A wave of reaction swept through the cathedral, some guests gasping audibly, others exchanging rapid whispers, a few even rising from their seats, as though preparing to leave immediately, unwilling to remain witnesses to such an unprecedented scandal. Sebastian's composure finally cracked entirely. "You would humiliate me in front of everyone I know, over a matter that could have been handled privately, with far less damage to both our families? You humiliated yourself," Elena said, "the moment you decided your comfort mattered more than my dignity. I am simply refusing to pretend otherwise for your convenience." Isabella had made her way to the altar as well now, standing beside her husband, both parents flanking their daughter as the full weight of the scandal settled over the cathedral. Josephine remained in the front pew, tears streaming silently down her face, torn between pride in Elena's courage and fear over what consequences might follow such a bold public stand. Camille, sensing that the situation had moved entirely beyond her control, took a small step backward, suddenly less certain of her earlier confidence. The guests around her had begun shifting away, creating a visible distance between themselves and the woman now openly identified as the cause of such public disgrace. "Sebastian," Camille said quietly, her earlier boldness fading into something closer to uncertainty, "perhaps we should discuss this matter away from so many eyes." "There is nothing left to discuss," Elena said, before Sebastian could respond, still holding the ring out steadily. "Take your ring back, Sebastian, and allow me to leave this cathedral with whatever dignity remains available to me." Slowly, reluctantly, Sebastian reached out and took the ring from her open palm, his fingers brushing against hers for what both of them understood would be the final time. The moment the ring left her hand, Elena felt something inside her chest loosen, as though a weight she had been carrying for weeks without fully realizing it had finally lifted away. She turned toward the priest, offering a small, sincere nod of apology for the disruption to his ceremony. "I am sorry for the disturbance this has caused within your cathedral, Father. It was never my intention to create such a scene, but I could not continue forward, knowing what I now know." The priest, still visibly shaken by the events of the past several minutes, offered a gentle nod in return. "There is no need for apology, my dear. Sometimes courage requires disruption, and I believe you have shown a great deal of courage here today." Elena turned to her parents next, taking each of their hands in her own. "I am sorry for the embarrassment this may bring upon our family name," she said quietly. "But I could not remain silent, not after everything I witnessed today." "You have nothing to apologize for," Antonio said firmly, pulling his daughter into a brief, tight embrace. "You have shown more strength today than most people manage in an entire lifetime." Isabella, tears in her eyes, reached up and gently adjusted the veil still resting against Elena's hair, though it no longer covered her face. "Whatever comes next," she whispered, "we will face it together, as a family." Elena took a deep breath, gathering the remaining fragments of her composure, and turned to face the cathedral one final time, before deciding what her next step would be. The cathedral remained frozen in stunned silence, as Elena turned to face the full congregation one last time. Every eye followed her movement, waiting to see what the young woman who had just refused a duke would do next. She had expected to feel afraid in this moment, standing exposed before hundreds of witnesses to her broken engagement. Instead, she felt something closer to relief, a strange lightness that surprised her given the weight of everything happening around her. "I understand many of you traveled great distances to witness this wedding," Elena said, her voice steady enough to carry through the entire cathedral. "I am sorry that what you witnessed instead was the truth about the man I nearly married. But I would rather stand before you today as an honest woman, without a title, than as a duchess built upon deception." A few guests began to applaud quietly, though most remained too shocked to react at all. Sebastian stood frozen near the altar, the ring Elena had returned still clutched in his hand, his earlier composure completely shattered. Camille had retreated several steps away from him, clearly aware that whatever protection his title had once offered her now stood in serious jeopardy. Charlotte, who had been seated further back in the cathedral, rushed forward through the crowd until she reached Elena's side. "I am so sorry I was not seated closer," Charlotte said breathlessly, taking Elena's hand. "But I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life." "You warned me," Elena said quietly. "I should have listened sooner." "You listened exactly when it mattered most," Charlotte replied. "That is what matters now." As the shock of the moment began to settle, practical concerns started pressing in around Elena. The wedding breakfast, planned for hundreds of guests in the gardens behind the Marchetti estate, would need to be addressed. The gifts already delivered would need to be returned or acknowledged. And beyond the immediate logistics, there remained the larger question of what would happen to her family's finances now that the marriage meant to secure them had collapsed entirely. Antonio seemed to read the worry crossing his daughter's face. "Do not concern yourself with such matters right now," he said firmly. "We will find a way forward, as we always have. Your well-being matters more than any debt owed to creditors." "But Papa," Elena began, "the arrangement with Sebastian's family was meant to resolve everything. Without it, I do not know how we will manage." "We managed before this marriage was arranged," Antonio said, "and we will manage after it, whatever form that management takes. I would rather lose every ship I once owned than watch my daughter live a lifetime of quiet suffering for the sake of financial convenience." Sebastian, overhearing this exchange, stepped forward once more, apparently recovering some measure of his earlier composure. "Elena," he said, "I understand you are angry, and rightfully so, but surely there remains a path forward that serves both our interests. I am prepared to end my arrangement with Camille entirely, if that is what stands between us and a peaceful resolution." The offer, made now in front of hundreds of witnesses rather than privately, struck Elena as almost laughable in its timing. Had he offered such a compromise weeks earlier, quietly and honestly, perhaps she might have considered it. But offering it now, only after being publicly exposed and humiliated, revealed exactly how little genuine remorse motivated the gesture. You are not offering to end things with Camille because you regret hurting me, Elena said. You are offering it because you regret being caught, and because you fear the damage this scandal will cause to your reputation among people whose opinions matter to you. Sebastian opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of whatever defense he had planned, closing it again without a word. Camille, watching this exchange from a distance, finally spoke up once more, her voice carrying a bitter edge that had not been present earlier. How convenient, she said, addressing Sebastian directly now rather than Elena, that you would so easily discard years of understanding between us, simply to salvage your reputation in front of strangers. Camille, Sebastian said warningly, clearly uncomfortable with this new direction of confrontation unfolding in front of so many witnesses. No, Camille continued, ignoring his warning entirely, her composure finally breaking under the weight of public humiliation. You promised me, years ago, that whatever arrangement you entered for the sake of family obligation would never change what existed between us. Yet here you stand, ready to abandon that promise the moment your bride dares to object publicly. The revelation, spoken aloud in front of the entire congregation, added a new layer of scandal to an already extraordinary scene. Sebastian had not merely maintained an affair alongside his engagement. He had made explicit promises to Camille about the nature and permanence of their relationship, promises that apparently predated his commitment to Elena by a significant margin. You made promises to her as well, Elena said slowly, looking between Sebastian and Camille with a mixture of disbelief and grim understanding. You promised loyalty to two women simultaneously, believing neither of us would ever discover the full truth. Neither Sebastian nor Camille offered any denial, their silence confirming what Elena had already suspected. The full congregation, having witnessed every stage of this unraveling deception, now understood the true scope of Sebastian's dishonesty, extending far beyond a simple lapse in judgment into something far more calculated and sustained. The Duchess Margaret, Sebastian's own mother, who had been seated in the front row throughout the entire ceremony, finally rose from her seat, her face pale with shame and anger in equal measure. She walked slowly toward her son, her expression leaving no doubt about her feelings regarding the scandal now threatening to consume the family name she had spent her entire life protecting. Sebastian, she said, her voice trembling with restrained fury, you have brought disgrace upon this family, in front of everyone whose respect we have spent generations earning. I raised you to understand honor, yet you stand here today having betrayed it completely, in the most public manner imaginable. Mother, Sebastian began, clearly startled by this unexpected confrontation from within his own family. Please, allow me to explain the full circumstances privately. There is no explanation that could justify what has happened here today, Margaret said firmly. I will speak with you at length once we have left this cathedral, but know now that I stand with Elena Marchetti in her decision to walk away from this marriage. She deserves far better than what you have offered her. The unexpected support from Sebastian's own mother sent another wave of murmurs through the crowd, guests exchanging glances as they processed this further complication to an already extraordinary scandal. Elena, though grateful for the Duchess's support, found herself too emotionally exhausted to feel much beyond quiet relief that at least one member of Sebastian's family recognized the wrong that had been done.
Thank you, Duchess, Elena said quietly.
Though I understand you owe me no particular loyalty, given the circumstances. I owe loyalty to honesty and decency, Margaret replied, regardless of family ties. What my son has done today reflects poorly on everyone who bears our family name, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to protect his reputation. The priest, watching this cascade of revelations and confrontations, finally stepped forward once more, attempting to bring some measure of order back to the chaotic scene. Perhaps, he suggested gently, it would be best if everyone gathered here today returned to their homes, allowing the families involved time to address these matters privately, away from further public scrutiny. Elena nodded gratefully at the suggestion, recognizing that remaining any longer within the cathedral would only prolong an already exhausting confrontation. She turned to her parents, ready to leave the building that had nearly witnessed her binding to a man who valued deception over honesty. But before she could take a single step toward the cathedral doors, Sebastian reached out and caught her arm gently, his expression pleading rather than demanding. Elena, please, he said quietly, give me one final chance to speak with you alone, away from all these witnesses. I owe you that much, At least, after everything that has happened here today. Elena looked down at his hand resting against her arm, then back up at his face, weighing whether any private conversation could possibly change the decision she had already made in front of hundreds of witnesses. Elena gently removed her arm from Sebastian's grip, though she did not immediately walk away. Something in his expression, a mixture of desperation and genuine regret, made her pause long enough to consider his request. Perhaps, she thought, hearing him speak privately would offer some measure of closure, even if it changed nothing about her decision. "Very well," she said finally. "A few minutes, in the small chapel behind the altar. But know now, Sebastian, that nothing you say will change what I have already decided." Sebastian nodded, relief flooding his features, as he gestured toward the smaller side chapel typically used for quiet prayer before larger ceremonies. Antonio moved to follow, but Elena raised a hand gently to stop him. "I will be fine, Papa," she said. "I need to hear whatever he has to say, if only to close this chapter completely in my own mind." Antonio hesitated, clearly reluctant to allow his daughter out of sight, given everything that had just unfolded. But he trusted her judgment enough to step back. "We will be waiting just outside these doors," he said firmly. "Call out if you need anything at all." Elena followed Sebastian into the smaller chapel, the sounds of the murmuring congregation fading slightly, as the heavy door closed behind them. The chapel was quiet and dim, lit only by candles flickering along the walls, a stark contrast to the bright, chaotic energy of the main cathedral. "I do not know where to begin," Sebastian said, running a hand through his hair, the composed Duke from earlier, now replaced by someone far more uncertain. "I never intended for you to discover things this way. I had planned to end my arrangement with Camille eventually, once the marriage had settled and no one would think to question it." "Eventually," Elena repeated. "You intended to marry me, build a household with me, perhaps even raise children with me, all while planning to continue an affair until it became convenient to end it. Do you hear how that sounds, Sebastian? When you say it that way, it sounds terrible," he admitted quietly. "But marriages among people of our position are rarely built on the same foundations as marriages between ordinary people. I believed, perhaps foolishly, that you would eventually come to understand and accept the practical realities involved." "I could never accept being deceived," Elena said. "Not because I am naive about how noble marriages function, but because you never gave me the choice to accept or reject those realities honestly. You simply assumed I would tolerate whatever arrangement suited you best, without ever asking what I might need or want from our marriage." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the ring still clutched in his hand. "What would you have wanted, had I asked you honestly before today?" "I would have wanted honesty," Elena said simply. "I would have wanted the chance to decide, with full knowledge of the circumstances, whether I could accept a marriage built on those terms. Perhaps I would have refused entirely. Perhaps, given enough honesty and enough respect, I might have found a way to accept certain realities. But you took that choice away from me completely, and that is what I cannot forgive." "I am sorry," Sebastian said, and for the first time since the ceremony had begun unraveling, his voice carried what sounded like genuine remorse, rather than mere concern for his reputation. "I convinced myself that protecting you from difficult truths was a form of kindness, when in reality, it was simply cowardice on my part." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of the man she had briefly allowed herself to hope she might grow to love. She found only someone who had made a series of choices rooted in self-interest, disguised even to himself as consideration for her feelings. "Thank you for admitting that much at least," she said. "But admission after exposure means very little, Sebastian. Real change requires honesty before consequences force it, not after." "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. "Where will you go, and how will your family manage without the security this marriage was meant to provide?" "I do not know all the answers yet," Elena admitted. "But I know I would rather face uncertainty honestly than security built on lies. My family will find a way forward, as families often do when faced with difficult circumstances." Sebastian nodded slowly, seeming to accept, at last, that no further argument or explanation would change Elena's decision. "I wish you had never discovered any of this," he said. "Not because I wanted to continue deceiving you, but because I genuinely believed we might have built something worthwhile together, despite everything else." "Perhaps we might have," Elena said, "but not built on the foundation you were prepared to offer." A marriage cannot thrive when one partner reserves the right to lie whenever honesty becomes inconvenient. She turned toward the chapel door, ready to rejoin her family and leave the cathedral entirely, but Sebastian's voice stopped her one final time. Camille will likely face far greater consequences from this scandal than I will, he said quietly. Society tends to judge women in her position far more harshly than the men involved. I wanted you to know that, regardless of everything else, I never intended for either of you to suffer this level of public humiliation. Elena turned back to face him, considering his words carefully. You are correct that Camille will likely face harsher judgment than you, she said. But that injustice exists because of choices men like you make, believing your reputations remain protected, while the women around you bear the consequences of decisions you made together. If you truly regret the harm caused today, perhaps you should consider how you might work to change that injustice, rather than simply acknowledging it exists. Sebastian had no immediate response to this observation, and Elena did not wait for one. She opened the chapel door and stepped back into the main cathedral, where her family waited exactly where they had promised to remain. Are you all right? Isabella asked immediately, searching her daughter's face for any sign of distress. I am, Elena said, and found that she meant it. There is nothing more to say between Sebastian and myself. I am ready to leave this place and begin figuring out what comes next. As the Marchetti family made their way toward the cathedral's main doors, guests parted to let them pass, some offering quiet words of support, others simply watching in stunned silence, as the bride who had refused a duke walked out with her head held high, veil still resting against her hair, rather than covering her face. Outside the cathedral, a crowd had gathered, drawn by whispers that had somehow already begun spreading through the streets, despite the ceremony having ended only minutes earlier. News of scandal, it seemed, traveled faster than any carriage. Among the crowd, Elena noticed a young man with a notebook and pencil, clearly a journalist for one of the local papers, watching the Marchetti family emerge with obvious professional interest. He approached carefully, offering a respectful nod before speaking. Miss Marchetti, he said. My name is Oliver Bennett. I write for the City Gazette. Might I ask what happened inside the cathedral today? The public deserves to know the truth, if you are willing to share it. Elena paused, considering the request. She could refuse, retreat quietly into her family's carriage, and allow whatever rumors emerged to shape public understanding of what had happened today. Or she could speak honestly, controlling her own narrative rather than allowing others to shape it for her. She chose the latter. I will speak with you, Elena said, but only if you are prepared to print the truth exactly as I tell it, without exaggeration or distortion. Oliver nodded eagerly, pencil already poised above his notebook. I promise you accuracy, Miss Marchetti. The people deserve an honest account of what transpired here today. Elena took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts before beginning to speak, aware that whatever she said next would likely shape how society viewed her decision for months, perhaps years, to come. Elena stood on the cathedral steps, the crowd growing thicker by the minute as word of the scandal spread through the surrounding streets. Oliver Bennett waited patiently, pencil ready, while Elena gathered her thoughts, aware that this moment would likely determine how the entire city remembered her decision. I entered this marriage believing in the possibility of an honest partnership, Elena began, her voice steady despite the growing audience. Today, I discovered that my groom brought the woman he had been unfaithful with directly into the cathedral, seating her among his own family during our wedding ceremony. When I learned the truth, I chose to end the marriage publicly, rather than continue a lifetime of quiet deception. Oliver wrote quickly, capturing her words exactly as she spoke them. Many women in your position might have chosen to remain silent, Miss Marchetti, given the social and financial consequences of walking away from such a marriage. What led you to speak out so openly instead? I considered silence, Elena admitted honestly. For weeks, I ignored warning signs, because I told myself that a stable marriage mattered more than my own dignity. But standing at that altar today, I realized that no amount of financial security could compensate for a lifetime spent pretending not to see the truth in front of me. A woman near the front of the crowd, an older widow named Beatrice, who had known the Marchetti family for many years, called out in support. You did the right thing, my dear. No woman should be expected to share her husband's affections in silence. Several other voices in the crowd murmured agreement, and Elena felt a small measure of comfort in realizing that public opinion, at least among the ordinary people gathered outside the cathedral, seemed to favor her decision rather than condemn it. "What do you believe will happen to your family's financial situation now that this marriage has ended?" Oliver asked, his question gentle but direct. Elena hesitated before answering, aware that her response would likely become public knowledge, regardless of how carefully she phrased it. "My family will face challenges," she said finally, "as we did before this arrangement was proposed. But we will face those challenges honestly, together, rather than trading my future for temporary security built on deception." Antonio, standing nearby, placed a supportive hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Might I add something, young man?" he asked Oliver, who nodded eagerly. "My daughter showed more courage today than most people demonstrate throughout their entire lives. Whatever financial difficulties our family faces moving forward, I am prouder of her in this moment than I have ever been." Oliver captured this statement as well, clearly recognizing the powerful narrative developing before him, one that would likely capture public sympathy far more effectively than a story of quiet, hidden suffering ever could. As the interview continued, the cathedral doors opened once more, and Sebastian emerged, flanked by his mother, the Duchess Margaret, whose expression remained set in stern disapproval. The crowd's attention immediately shifted, murmurs rising, as people recognized the Duke at the center of the unfolding scandal. "Duke Ashworth," Oliver called out, seizing the opportunity presented by Sebastian's unexpected appearance. "Might you offer any comment regarding what transpired inside the cathedral today?" Sebastian's face tightened, clearly unprepared to address the press so soon after such a public humiliation. "This is a private family matter," he said stiffly, "not suited for public discussion." "With respect, Duke Ashworth," Oliver replied, undeterred. "The matter became public the moment it unfolded in front of hundreds of witnesses inside a cathedral. Surely you understand that public curiosity now extends beyond what might have remained private under different circumstances." Sebastian glanced toward Elena, perhaps hoping she might intervene on his behalf, but Elena remained silent, unwilling to offer him any assistance in managing the consequences of choices he alone had made. The Duchess Margaret, standing beside her son, finally spoke up herself, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect in difficult situations. "My son's actions today were inexcusable," she said plainly, surprising both Oliver and the surrounding crowd with her candor. "Miss Marchetti showed remarkable dignity throughout an experience no bride should ever be forced to endure. Our family owes her a sincere apology, which I offer now, publicly, given that the offense itself occurred so publicly." Elena, startled by this unexpected public apology, offered the Duchess a small, grateful nod. "Thank you, Duchess. Your words mean more than you might realize." Sebastian, visibly uncomfortable with his mother's candid admission, said nothing further, apparently recognizing that any attempt to minimize the situation further would only damage his reputation more severely in front of the assembled crowd, and the journalist eagerly recording every word. As the crowd continued to grow and murmur among themselves, Camille emerged from the cathedral as well, moving quickly toward a waiting carriage, clearly hoping to avoid further public scrutiny. But the crowd, having already learned her identity through overheard conversations and spreading rumors, turned toward her as she passed, some offering disapproving glances, others calling out questions she chose not to answer. Elena watched this scene unfold with a complicated mixture of emotions. Part of her recognized the truth in her own earlier words to Sebastian, that society would likely judge Camille more harshly than it judged him, despite both of them sharing equal responsibility for the deception that had unfolded. Yet Elena found she had little sympathy remaining to offer, given how coldly Camille had spoken to her only minutes earlier inside the cathedral. "Miss Marchetti," Oliver said, drawing Elena's attention back to the interview, "what message would you offer to other women who might find themselves facing similar circumstances, discovering betrayal only after committing to a marriage they believed was built on honesty?" Elena considered the question carefully before responding, aware that her answer might offer genuine comfort or guidance to women facing similar struggles in the future. "I would tell them that dignity matters more than security," she said finally. "I would tell them that no financial stability is worth a lifetime of pretending not to see clearly. And I would tell them that speaking the truth, even when it feels frightening and uncertain, is always better than living quietly within a lie." The crowd, many of whom had been listening closely throughout the entire exchange, responded with quiet murmurs of approval. several women nodding in solemn agreement with Elena's words. Charlotte, standing nearby throughout the entire interview, finally stepped forward and gently took Elena's arm. "Perhaps it is time to return home," she suggested quietly. "You have faced enough for one day, and your family will need time to process everything that has happened." Elena nodded, suddenly feeling the full exhaustion of the morning settling over her all at once. She thanked Oliver for his patience and promised to speak further if additional questions arose once his article was published, then allowed Charlotte to guide her toward the waiting Marchetti carriage. As she climbed into the carriage alongside her parents, Elena glanced back one final time toward the cathedral steps, where Sebastian remained standing beside his mother, the crowd still murmuring around them, the scandal already beginning to spread through the city faster than anyone could have anticipated. Whatever came next, Elena understood that her life had changed irrevocably in the span of a single morning, and there would be no returning to the person she had been before stepping through those cathedral doors. 3 months passed since the morning Elena Marchetti walked out of the cathedral without becoming a duchess. The story Oliver Bennett published in the City Gazette had spread far beyond the borders of their small city, carried by travelers and merchants into neighboring provinces, until Elena's name had become known throughout the region as the bride who chose honesty over a title. The initial weeks following the scandal had been difficult. Some members of noble society, loyal to Sebastian's family through generations of alliance, had whispered unkind things about Elena's judgment in speaking so publicly, rather than resolving matters privately. But far more voices, particularly among the merchant classes and ordinary townspeople, had celebrated her courage, sending letters of support to the Marchetti household in numbers that surprised the entire family. Antonio's financial situation, while still challenging, had improved unexpectedly through an unlikely source. A wealthy merchant from a neighboring city, having read Oliver's published account of Elena's honesty and courage, reached out to Antonio with an offer of partnership, expressing admiration for a family that valued integrity, even when it came at significant personal cost. The partnership, while not immediately solving every financial difficulty the Marchetti family faced, offered a genuine path forward, built on mutual respect, rather than desperate necessity. Elena spent much of those 3 months helping her father navigate this new business relationship, discovering within herself a talent for negotiation and organization that she had never previously had the opportunity to develop. Where once she had imagined her future entirely defined by marriage and household management, she now found herself drawn toward the practical challenges of trade and commerce, subjects that had always interested her father, but which she had never been encouraged to study seriously herself. "You have a natural understanding for this work," Antonio told her one evening, as they reviewed shipping contracts together in his study. "Perhaps, had circumstances been different, I should have taught you these skills years ago, rather than assuming marriage was the only path available to you." "Perhaps it is not too late to learn now," Elena replied, smiling at the thought of a future she had never previously considered possible. Charlotte visited frequently during these months, often bringing news from the wider social circles they had once moved within together. Sebastian, she reported, had faced significant consequences from the scandal, with several important political and social alliances quietly withdrawing their support following the public revelation of his character. The Duchess Margaret, true to the conviction she had expressed outside the cathedral, had reportedly distanced herself from her son's affairs considerably, disappointed by choices she felt reflected poorly on the values she had tried to instill in him throughout his life. Camille, meanwhile, had left the city entirely, unable to withstand the harsh judgment of a society that, exactly as Elena had predicted, held her far more accountable than it held Sebastian for their shared deception. Elena felt a complicated mixture of emotions upon hearing this news, recognizing the unfairness in how society distributed blame between men and women involved in the same circumstances, yet unable to summon much sympathy given how coldly Camille had spoken to her during their brief but memorable confrontation. "Do you ever regret how publicly you handled everything?" Charlotte asked one afternoon, as the two friends walked together through the gardens behind the Marchetti estate, the same gardens that had once been prepared for a wedding reception that never took place. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I regret that it became necessary at all," she said finally. "I regret trusting someone who did not deserve that trust, and I regret the pain this scandal caused my family, even though they have supported me completely throughout it. But I do not regret speaking honestly, in front of everyone, rather than accepting a lifetime of quiet humiliation. Your courage that day changed more than just your own life, Charlotte observed. I have heard from several other women, through various social connections, who have found the strength to address their own difficult marriages more honestly, inspired by what you demonstrated inside that cathedral. Elena had not previously considered this broader impact of her decision, and the thought brought her a quiet sense of satisfaction that extended beyond her own personal circumstances. Perhaps, she realized, choosing honesty over comfortable silence carried consequences that reached further than she had initially imagined, offering encouragement to others facing similarly difficult choices. Josephine, who had remained loyal throughout the entire ordeal, continued serving as Elena's closest companion within the household, though their relationship had evolved somewhat beyond the traditional boundaries between mistress and maid. Having witnessed everything from the initial suspicious bracelet to the final confrontation inside the cathedral, Josephine had become someone Elena trusted implicitly, a genuine friend rather than merely a household employee. Do you think you will marry eventually? Josephine asked one evening, as they sat together reviewing correspondence that had arrived throughout the week, much of it still relating to the ongoing public interest in Elena's story. Perhaps, Elena said thoughtfully. But if I do marry again, it will be to someone who values honesty as much as I do. Someone willing to build a partnership based on mutual respect rather than convenient arrangement. I would rather remain unmarried indefinitely than repeat the mistake of trusting someone who views deception as an acceptable foundation for marriage. As the months continued to pass, Elena found herself increasingly involved in her father's business affairs, eventually taking on responsibilities that would have been unimaginable for a woman of her social standing only a year earlier. The new business partnership continued to strengthen, gradually restoring the Marchetti family's financial stability, without requiring the sacrifice of dignity that Sebastian's proposed marriage would have demanded. Oliver Bennett continued following Elena's story periodically, publishing occasional updates on her family's recovery and her own personal growth following the scandal. These articles, rather than diminishing over time, seemed to strengthen public admiration for the choices Elena had made, cementing her reputation not as a woman who had failed to secure a prestigious marriage, but as someone who had demonstrated remarkable integrity under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. 1 year after the events inside the cathedral, Elena stood once again in that same building, though this time, for an entirely different occasion. Charlotte was marrying a kind, honest merchant named Edward Whitfield, a man who had courted her openly and honestly throughout their entire relationship, without secrets or hidden arrangements complicating their commitment to one another. Standing among the guests, watching her closest friend exchange genuine vows built on authentic love and mutual respect, Elena felt no bitterness toward her own unfinished wedding from a year earlier. Instead, she felt a quiet gratitude for the courage she had found within herself that day, courage that had ultimately led her toward a life built on her own terms, defined by her own choices rather than circumstances imposed upon her by others. After the ceremony concluded successfully, without any scandal or interruption, Elena walked out of the cathedral into bright afternoon sunlight, her father and mother beside her, Josephine and Charlotte's other friends following close behind. She paused briefly on the same steps where she had once given her first public interview to Oliver Bennett, remembering the uncertainty and fear that had accompanied that difficult morning. Looking back now, she understood that removing her veil inside that cathedral had not been an ending, as she had feared in the moment, but rather a beginning, the first step toward a life built entirely on her own honest terms. Elena smiled, took her father's arm, and walked forward into whatever her future held next, no longer afraid of uncertainty, having learned that honesty, however difficult in the moment, always offered a stronger foundation than any comfortable deception ever could. 2 years after Charlotte's wedding, a letter arrived at the Marchetti estate, carrying a seal Elena did not immediately recognize. She opened it carefully at her writing desk, the same desk where she now handled correspondence for the shipping partnership her father had built with the merchant who once admired her courage from a distance. The letter came from a woman named Victoria Ashworth, a distant relative of Sebastian's family, someone Elena had never personally met. Victoria explained that she had recently ended her own engagement after discovering her intended husband maintained a secret arrangement, similar to the one Elena had exposed years earlier. She wrote that Elena's story, still remembered and discussed among certain social circles, had given her the courage to act rather than remain silent. Elena read the letter twice, feeling a familiar warmth spread through her chest, the same quiet satisfaction she had felt when Charlotte first told her that other women had drawn strength from her example. She wrote back promptly, offering Victoria genuine encouragement and practical advice about rebuilding a life after such a difficult decision, drawing from her own experience, navigating both the immediate aftermath and the slower process of establishing independence afterward. This exchange marked the beginning of something Elena had not anticipated when she first spoke to Oliver Bennet outside the cathedral doors. Over the following months, additional letters arrived from women in similar circumstances, some facing broken engagements, others already trapped within unhappy marriages built on secrets they had only recently discovered. Elena found herself corresponding regularly with a growing circle of women who valued her perspective precisely because she had lived through the exact experience they now faced themselves. Isabella, noticing the growing stack of correspondence on her daughter's desk, suggested an idea one evening over dinner. "Perhaps," she said, "you might consider organizing something more formal. A gathering, perhaps, where women facing similar difficulties could speak with one another directly, rather than relying solely on written letters." Elena considered the suggestion carefully. The idea of creating a space where women could speak openly about difficult marriages and broken engagements, without fear of judgment or social consequence, appealed to her deeply. She discussed the concept with Charlotte, who immediately offered her support and practical assistance in organizing such gatherings. The first meeting took place in the same garden behind the Marchetti estate that had once been prepared for Elena's original wedding celebration. A dozen women attended. Some Elena had corresponded with directly, others invited through word of mouth after hearing about the planned gathering. They spoke honestly about their experiences, offering one another support and practical guidance that many had never previously felt comfortable sharing within their own households. Word of these gatherings spread gradually, and within a year, similar meetings had begun forming in other cities throughout the region, each inspired by the original example set within the Marchetti Gardens. Elena found herself traveling occasionally to speak at these gatherings, sharing her own story, not for the sake of public attention, but genuinely hoping to offer comfort and encouragement to women navigating similarly painful circumstances. Antonio's business partnership continued flourishing throughout these years, eventually expanding to include additional shipping routes that Elena herself helped negotiate, drawing on skills she had developed through years of careful study and practical experience. Her reputation within business circles grew alongside her reputation as an advocate for honesty within personal relationships, creating an unusual but respected position within society that few women of her generation had managed to achieve. Sebastian, meanwhile, had largely faded from public conversation, his political ambitions permanently damaged by the scandal that continued to follow his name whenever it arose in conversation. Elena heard occasional updates through Charlotte's social connections, learning that he had eventually married another woman from a distant province, though whether that marriage was built on honesty or merely better concealed deception, Elena had no way of knowing, and found she no longer particularly cared to discover. Josephine, still Elena's closest companion after all these years, married a kind stable hand from a neighboring estate, a quiet man named Frederick who treated her with the same gentle respect she had always shown toward Elena throughout their years together. Elena attended their small, joyful wedding with genuine happiness, grateful to see her dear friend find the honest partnership she deserved. On a quiet afternoon, nearly 5 years after the events inside the cathedral, Elena sat in her father's study, reviewing shipping documents when Josephine, now visiting rather than serving, mentioned an interesting piece of news she had heard while running errands in town. "They say a young woman refused to marry a wealthy merchant's son just last week," Josephine reported, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. Apparently, she discovered he had been dishonest about significant debts he owed, hidden carefully, until after the engagement had been announced publicly. She ended things immediately, upon learning the truth, rather than proceeding with the marriage despite the deception. "Good for her," Elena said, smiling as she continued reviewing her documents. "I hope she finds the same peace I eventually found, once the initial difficulty passes." "They are already calling her brave throughout the town," Josephine added, "comparing her to you, in fact. Your story has become something of a local legend among young women, considering their own engagements." Elena paused her work, considering this observation with quiet satisfaction. She had never set out to become any kind of symbol or example when she removed her veil inside that cathedral 5 years earlier. She had simply refused to accept a lifetime of quiet deception, choosing instead to face an uncertain future honestly, rather than a secure future built on lies. Yet somehow, through that single moment of courage, she had helped create space for other women to make similarly difficult choices, understanding that dignity and honesty mattered more than whatever security a dishonest arrangement might promise. That evening, as the sun set over the gardens behind the Marchetti estate, Elena walked slowly among the flowers, remembering the frightened young bride who had once stood trembling in this very garden, uncertain whether her wedding day would bring happiness or heartbreak. She thought of Sebastian, of Camille, of the cathedral filled with shocked witnesses, and of the long, difficult path that had led her from that morning to the confident, independent woman she had become. She thought, too, of all the letters still arriving regularly from women she had never met, each one thanking her for the courage she had shown, each one representing another life changed for the better, because Elena had chosen honesty over comfortable silence, on a morning that could easily have unfolded very differently. Elena smiled softly to herself as she continued her evening walk through the garden, grateful for every difficult choice that had led her toward this peaceful, honest life, a life built entirely on her own terms, defined not by the wedding that never happened, but by everything meaningful she had built in the years that followed it. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, Elena faced them now without fear, secure in the knowledge that honesty, however difficult in the moment it demanded courage, always provided a stronger foundation than any comfortable deception ever could offer in its place.